Some challenges in life test more than courage. They test the very fiber of who we are. In 1870s Colorado, a wealthy widow named Victoria Harrington spoke words that would haunt 25 men. "If you're a real mountain man, hunt a bear for me." Strong men tried and failed. The wilderness claimed their pride and sometimes their lives. But when weathered mountain man Garrett Stone heard her challenge, he didn't boast or brag. He simply nodded once and disappeared into the deadly peaks. 25 men had failed before him. What made this scarred survivor believe he could succeed where others had perished? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to Silver Creek like memories of the past, reluctant to let go of the valley that had seen so much heartbreak. Victoria Harrington stood behind the counter of her trading post, her fingers absently turning the gold wedding ring that had been her constant companion for 3 years, ever since Theodore's funeral. The ring caught the early sunlight streaming through the dusty window, casting small golden circles on the worn wooden counter that had been Theodore's pride and joy. At 42, Victoria possessed the kind of beauty that comes from surviving life's storms. Her auburn hair, now touched with premature silver at the temples, was pulled back in a practical bun that revealed the elegant line of her neck. Her green eyes held depths that spoke of love found and lost, of dreams that had died with her husband in the unforgiving wilderness beyond the town's borders. She wore a simple black dress that had once been her finest, now faded from years of mourning that seemed to have no end. Silver Creek had grown around the trading post like a child around its mother's skirts. What had started as a simple supply station for miners and trappers had evolved into a proper town, complete with a saloon, a church, and enough wooden buildings to house nearly 300 souls. The main street was still dirt, rutted from countless wagon wheels and horse hooves, but there was something dignified about the way the buildings faced each other across that muddy divide. Theodore Harrington had built this empire with his bare hands and an unshakable belief that civilization could flourish even in the wildest places. He'd been a bear of a man himself, standing 6 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry the dreams of an entire community. His laugh had been infectious, his handshake firm, and his word as solid as the mountains that surrounded their valley. When he died, Victoria had inherited not just his wealth, but his responsibilities and the crushing weight of a love story that would never have its proper ending. The challenge had begun innocently enough. Men came to the trading post seeking supplies, but inevitably they'd start seeking Victoria's attention as well. She was, after all, one of the wealthiest women in the territory, and widows of means rarely stayed unmarried for long in a place where women were scarce. But Victoria had no interest in marrying again, not because she couldn't love again, but because no man who came calling seemed worthy of the legacy Theodore had built. "If you're a real mountain man," she'd said to the first suitor, a cocky young trapper named Murphy, who'd boasted about his hunting prowess while trying to impress her with tales of his adventures, "hunt a bear for me." She'd meant it as a dismissal, a way to send him away without breaking his spirit entirely. But Murphy had taken her seriously, and 3 days later, the search party had found him treed by a black bear, his rifle lost somewhere in his pack. Flight through the wilderness. Word of Victoria's challenge spread through the territory like wildfire. Men came from as far as Denver and Santa Fe, drawn by the combination of wealth, beauty, and the irresistible lure of proving their manhood. There was Big Jim Hawkins, who claimed to have killed more bears than any man alive. The search party found his torn clothes and broken rifle, but never found Big Jim. There was Carlos Mendez, a former soldier who approached the challenge with military precision. He lasted 4 days before limping back to town with 3 broken ribs and a story about a grizzly that seemed to anticipate his every move. 25 men had tried. 25 men had failed. Some came back injured and humbled. Others didn't come back at all. The town had started keeping a tally board in Murphy's saloon, marking each failure with a simple X. The locals had begun taking bets on how long each new challenger would last, though the smart money was always on failure. Victoria hadn't intended for her words to become a death sentence. She tried to withdraw the challenge after the third man died, but by then it had taken on a life of its own. Men kept coming, their pride and their interpretation of her words, driving them into the wilderness like moths drawn to a deadly flame. She'd stopped trying to dissuade them. They wouldn't listen anyway, and her protests only seemed to fuel their determination. The truth was darker than the town knew. The bear that had killed Theodore wasn't just any grizzly. It was a legendary creature the local Ute tribe called Old Ghost, a massive male that had terrorized the high country for over a decade. Theodore had been tracking it for weeks when it finally caught him in a narrow canyon with no escape route. The tribal elders said Old Ghost was as clever as he was large, a creature that had learned to hunt men as skillfully as men hunted him. This was the beast Victoria was inadvertently sending these men to face, and she knew it. Each failure weighed on her conscience like stones in her pockets, but she couldn't bring herself to reveal the truth. To do so would be to admit that Theodore's death hadn't been a noble sacrifice or a tragic accident. It had been the inevitable conclusion of his obsession with a creature that was smarter and more dangerous than any of them had imagined. The morning of Garrett Stone's arrival began like any other. Victoria was arranging supplies on the shelves when she heard the distinctive sound of a horse's hooves on the wooden planks outside. She looked up to see a figure dismounting from a sturdy bay mare, and even from inside the store, she could tell this man was different from the others. Garrett Stone moved with the fluid economy of motion that comes only from decades of living in the wilderness. He was tall but not imposing, perhaps 6 feet even, with a lean build that spoke of strength earned rather than displayed. His dark hair was shot through with gray at the temples, and his face bore the kind of weathering that comes from facing down storms, both literal and metaphorical. A network of scars traced his left cheek and jawed marks that had healed clean but left their permanent testimony to violence survived. He wore buckskin pants and a wool shirt that had seen better years, both mended with the careful stitches of a man who made do with what he had. His boots were worn but well-maintained, and the rifle across his shoulder was an old Sharps that gleamed with the kind of care that comes from depending on your tools for survival. But it was his eyes that set him apart, gray as winter sky, with depths that suggested he'd seen things most men couldn't imagine and made peace with them all. When he stepped through the door of the trading post, Victoria felt something shift in the air, like the moment before thunder rolls across the mountains. He removed his hat, a battered affair that had protected him from countless storms, and nodded respectfully. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the gravelly undertones of a man who often went days without speaking to another human soul. "I'm Garrett Stone. I hear you've got a challenge needs meeting." Victoria studied his face, searching for the telltale signs of bravado or false confidence she'd learned to recognize in the other men. She found neither. What she saw instead was something that made her heart skip, not excitement, but recognition. This man understood the weight of what she was asking, because he'd carried similar burdens himself. "You've heard about the bear," she said, not making it a question. "I've heard." He set his hat on the counter with deliberate care. "I've also heard that 25 good men have tried and failed. That tells me this isn't just any bear you're talking about." Victoria's hand moved instinctively to the wedding ring, her fingers finding the worn gold band that had become her anchor to the past. "My husband called him Old Ghost. The Utes say he's been killing in these mountains for more years than anyone can count." "Old Ghost." Garrett nodded slowly, and Victoria saw something flicker in his eyes. Not fear, but a kind of professional interest. "I've heard that name before. Up north, near the Wyoming line." Trappers talk about a grizzly that hunts men like men hunt deer. That's the one. Victoria's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. That's the one that killed Theodore. And that's the one I've been sending men to face without telling them what they're really up against. The admission hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Most men would have turned around and walked out at that point, their courage evaporating in the face of such odds. But Garrett Stone simply studied her face with those winter-gray eyes, and she had the unsettling feeling that he was seeing straight through to her soul. Why? He asked finally. The question was simple, but Victoria knew he wasn't asking why she'd hidden the truth from the other men. He was asking why she needed old ghosts dead. What drove a widow to send men to their deaths in pursuit of something that might be better left alone? Because, she said, her voice stronger now, as long as that creature is alive, my husband's death means nothing. Theodore died trying to protect this valley, and that bear is still out there, still killing. Every day it lives is another day his sacrifice was wasted. Garrett was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from her face to the wedding ring she was unconsciously turning around her finger. When he looked back at her, there was something different in his expression, a kind of understanding that came from recognizing pain that mirrored his own. I'll need 3 days to prepare, he said finally, and I'll need you to understand that I might not come back either. Victoria felt her throat tighten. I know. Then we have an understanding. Garrett picked up his hat and settled it back on his head. I'll take your challenge, Mrs. Harrington, but I'm not doing it to court you or claim your hand or any other fool reason. I'm doing it because some things need doing, and I've got the skills to do them. As he walked toward the door, Victoria called after him, Mr. Stone, why are you really doing this? He paused with his hand on the door handle, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he turned back, and she saw something in his face that made her understand they were more alike than she'd realized. Because, he said quietly, I've got my own ghost to settle with, and sometimes the only way forward is through. Then he was gone, leaving Victoria alone with her thoughts and the weight of what she'd set in motion once again. But this time felt different. This time, she wasn't sending a man to his death. She was sending a warrior to face a demon that had haunted them both for far too long. Victoria waited until the sun was setting behind the western peaks before she made her way to the small cabin behind the trading post where Garrett had set up camp. She carried Theodore's journal clutched against her chest like a shield, the blood-stained leather volume she'd never shown to any of the other men who'd taken her challenge. She found Garrett sitting by a small fire, methodically cleaning his rifle with the kind of attention that spoke of ritual rather than mere maintenance. His Baymar was picketed nearby, contentedly cropping the sparse grass, and his bedroll was arranged with military precision. When he heard her approach, he looked up but didn't stop his work. Mrs. Harrington, he said, his voice carrying no surprise. I wondered if you'd come. Victoria settled herself on a fallen log across from him, the journal heavy in her lap. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on their faces and filling the silence with the ancient comfort of flame against darkness. I have something that belongs to you now, she said finally, extending the journal toward him. If you're really going after old Ghost, you need to know what Theodore learned about him. Garrett set down his rifle and took the journal with hands that were gentler than she'd expected from such a weathered man. The leather cover was stained dark brown in places Theodore's blood, dried and permanent as a brand. Garrett opened it carefully, his eyes moving across Theodore's familiar handwriting with the focused attention of a man reading his own death warrant. He tracked old Ghost for 3 weeks, Victoria said, her voice barely audible above the fire's whisper. The bear led him deeper into the high country than any man had gone before. Theodore was convinced the creature was testing him, learning his habits the way a chess master studies his opponent. Garrett turned the pages slowly, stopping occasionally to study Theodore's sketches of paw prints and claw marks. The journal was methodical, detailed, the work of a man who understood he was facing something extraordinary and wanted to leave a record for whoever might follow in his footsteps. "Your husband was a good tracker," Garrett said, tracing one of Theodore's drawings with his finger. "These measurements. This bear is bigger than anything I've seen. 9 feet, maybe 10 when it stands. Paws the size of dinner plates. Keep reading," Victoria whispered. Garrett found the entry she meant, dated just 2 days before Theodore's death. His voice was steady as he read aloud, but Victoria could see the tension gathering in his shoulders. "Bay 21. The bear is hunting me now. I can feel it watching from the ridgelines, always staying just out of rifle range. It killed the elk this morning and left the carcass where I would find it a message. This creature understands intimidation. It's trying to break my nerve before we meet face to face. I won't give it the satisfaction." Garrett looked up from the journal, his gray eyes reflecting the firelight. He knew what was coming. The last entry is worse. Victoria's voice broke slightly. He knew he was going to die, but he went into that canyon anyway. Garrett found the final entry, written in Theodore's increasingly erratic handwriting. The words seemed to leap off the page with desperate urgency. "Final day. Old Ghost has led me to Devil's Canyon, no way out except the way I came. He's waiting for me in there. I can hear him moving in the rocks above. This is how it ends then. If someone finds this journal, tell Victoria I love her, and tell whoever comes after me that this bear isn't just an animal. It thinks, it plans, it remembers. Don't hunt it like a beast hunt, it like a man who's learned to be something more dangerous than any man should be." Garrett closed the journal carefully and held it for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made Victoria understand why she trusted him from the moment he walked into her store. 25 men, he said quietly. 25 good men who never had a chance because they were hunting an animal instead of a killer who just happens to walk on 4 legs. "Will you still go?" Victoria asked, though she already knew the answer. Garrett looked at her across the fire, and she saw something in his expression that made her heart race, not fear for his safety, but a sudden, overwhelming certainty that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't imagine. "Mrs. Harrington," he said, "I need to tell you something about myself, something that might change how you feel about this arrangement." Victoria waited, her hands gripping the edge of the log she sat on. 15 years ago, I had a family. A wife named Sarah and a daughter named Emma, just turned 8 years old." Garrett's voice was steady, but Victoria could hear the old pain beneath the words. "We lived up north, near the Yellowstone country, in a cabin I built with my own hands." The fire popped and sent sparks spiraling into the darkening sky. Victoria remained silent, understanding that some stories needed to be told completely before they could be truly heard. "A rogue grizzly came through our valley that spring, not as big as Old Ghost, but just as smart and twice as mean. It killed our livestock, destroyed our cabin, and when I went tracking it," Garrett paused, his jaw working silently for a moment. "When I came home, I found what was left of my family." Victoria felt tears sting her eyes. "Garrett, I spent 2 years tracking that bear," he continued, his voice gaining strength. 2 years learning everything there was to know about how a grizzly thinks, how it plans, how it kills. And when I finally cornered it in a box canyon, not unlike the one that claimed your husband, I didn't just kill it. I made it understand what it had taken from me." He looked directly at Victoria then, and she saw something in his eyes that made her understand why he'd accepted her challenge so readily. "Old Ghost isn't just the bear that killed your husband," Garrett said. "According to the stories the trappers tell, it's the same bear that killed my family. The timeline fits, the territory matches, and the description. He tapped a journal. Your Theodore was a careful man. His measurements, his observations. This is the same creature that destroyed my life 15 years ago. Victoria stared at him, her mind struggling to process what he was telling her. We both have the same ghost to lay to rest, Garrett said. The difference is, I've spent 15 years preparing for this meeting. I know how this bear thinks because I've lived inside its shadow since the day it made me a widower. The revelation hung between them like a bridge suddenly spanning an impossible chasm. Victoria understood now why Garrett had seemed so familiar. To her, why she'd recognized something in his eyes from the moment he'd walked into her store. They were bound together by loss, by the same creature that had stolen their happiness and left them both wandering in the wilderness of grief. Will killing it bring them back? Victoria asked, though she already knew the answer. No, Garrett said simply, but it might let us both stop running from their memory. Victoria stood up slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. She walked around the fire to where Garrett sat, and without saying a word, she placed her hand on his shoulder. His muscles were tense beneath her palm, coiled like springs from years of carrying burdens too heavy for one person to bear alone. Then we're not just settling your account with that bear, she said quietly. We're settling mine too. Garrett looked up at her, and for the first time since he'd arrived in Silver Creek, Victoria saw something other than grim determination in his face. She saw hope, fragile and tentative, but real nonetheless. Tomorrow morning, he said, I'm going into those mountains, and I'm not coming back until old Ghost is dead. Tomorrow morning, Victoria replied. We're both going to start letting go of the past. As she walked back to her cabin, Theodore's journal tucked securely under her arm, Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 long years. For the first time since her husband's death, she wasn't facing the future alone. Whatever happened in the mountains, she and Garrett Stone would face it together, bound by shared loss and the hope of shared redemption. The first gray light of dawn was just beginning to touch the peaks when Garrett Stone rode out of Silver Creek. Victoria stood on the porch of her trading post, wrapped in a heavy shawl against the mountain chill, watching until horse and rider disappeared into the timber that marked the beginning of the high country. She remained there long after the sound of hooves had faded, her hand resting unconsciously on the spot where Theodore's journal pressed against her heart. Garrett followed. The game trail that wound steadily upward through stands of aspen and pine, his mare picking her way carefully over ground that grew increasingly treacherous with altitude. He'd studied Theodore's maps by firelight until he could trace the route in his sleep. 3 days hard riding to reach the territory where old Ghost held dominion. Then the real work would begin. The air grew thinner as he climbed, and the familiar weight of the mountains settled around him like an old coat. This was his element, the high country, where men were measured not by their words or their wealth, but by their ability to survive in a landscape that offered no mercy to the unprepared. Every rock, every tree, every shift in the wind carried information for those who knew how to read it. By midday, he'd reached the first of Theodore's marked campsites, a small clearing beside a creek where the water ran clear and cold from the snowpack above, scattered among the pine needles. Garrett found the remains of other camps, the bones of men who'd taken Victoria's challenge and found themselves unprepared for what awaited them in these heights. He dismounted and walked the perimeter of the clearing, reading the story written in disturbed earth and broken branches. Here was where young Murphy had made his stand before the black bear treat him scuff. Marks in the dirt showed where he'd scrambled for purchase on bark too smooth to hold his weight. There, a glint of metal half buried in the loam revealed a brass cartridge case from Carlos Mendez's military-issue rifle, but it was what Garrett found beside a lightning-struck pine that made him understand how completely the other men had misunderstood their opponent. Hanging from a piece of rawhide tied around a broken branch was an ancient bear claw necklace, its yellow talons larger than any he'd ever seen. The leather was decades old, and bore the distinctive beadwork of the Ute people. Garrett cut the necklace down and examined it carefully. The claws were massive, easily 4 inches long and thick as his thumb. More importantly, they showed the wear patterns of age. These weren't fresh trophies, but relics from kills made years or even decades ago. Old Ghost had been hunting in these mountains far longer than anyone had imagined. He tucked the necklace into his saddlebags and continued his examination of the campsite. The story it told was always the same man arriving with confidence and modern weapons, making camp in the obvious spots, following the predictable patterns that had served them well in hunting ordinary game. None of them had understood that they were facing a predator that had learned to anticipate human behavior through decades of deadly trial and error. As Garrett set up his own camp, he deliberately chose a spot that violated every rule of comfort and convenience. Instead of the flat ground near the creek, he positioned himself on a slight rise with clear sight lines in all directions. Instead of building his fire in the traditional way, he constructed a small, smokeless flame that would be invisible from more than 50 yards away. Most importantly, he didn't make the mistake of thinking his rifle made him the apex predator in these mountains. That night, as he sat beside his carefully controlled fire, Garrett allowed his mind to drift back to the early days of his own education in the ways of dangerous bears. After Sarah and Emma's death, he'd made every mistake the men in Victoria's challenge had made. He'd relied too heavily on his weapons, underestimated his opponent, and nearly paid for his arrogance with his life. The scars on his face and neck were reminders of that first encounter with the bear that had destroyed his family. He'd cornered it in what he thought was a perfect ambush, only to discover that the grizzly had been herding him toward that exact spot for days. The beast had exploded from cover like a force of nature, and only blind luck and a tree branch that broke his fall had kept him from joining Sarah and Emma in death. But that near-fatal encounter had taught him the most important lesson of his life, a lesson that had apparently eluded every man who'd taken Victoria's challenge. You couldn't hunt a killer bear like Old Ghost the way you hunted ordinary game. You had to think like your prey, anticipate its moves, and above all, you had to accept that in the high country, the rules of civilization meant nothing. A branch cracked in the darkness beyond his firelight, and Garrett's hand moved instinctively to his rifle. But instead of grabbing the weapon, he forced himself to remain perfectly still, listening to the night sounds with the focused attention of a man whose life had always depended on hearing the things that didn't belong there. The soft shuffle of something large moving through the undergrowth. Not the random wandering of an elk or deer, but the purposeful movement of a predator investigating something that had caught its interest. Garrett let his breathing slow and steady, becoming part of the landscape rather than an intrusion upon it. The sounds moved in a careful circle around his camp, always staying just beyond the reach of firelight. Whatever was out there was taking its time, studying him with the patience of something that had learned the value of thorough reconnaissance. Garrett smiled grimly to himself. If this was Old Ghost, then the bear was already demonstrating the intelligence that had made it so deadly to men who expected to face a simple animal. The circling continued for nearly an hour before the sounds finally faded back into the wilderness. Garrett maintained his vigil until dawn, but his visitor didn't return. When the sun finally rose, he found tracks in the soft earth at the edge of his camp paw prints that matched Theodore's careful measurements exactly. Old Ghost had found him on his first night in the high country. The message was clear. The bear knew he was coming, and unlike the previous challengers, this hunt would be conducted on terms that the grizzly had chosen. Garrett studied the tracks with professional interest, noting the deliberate placement that suggested the bear had wanted them found. This wasn't random wandering. This was psychological warfare. The kind of mind game that separated old Ghost from every other predator in the mountains. "All right, old friend," Garrett murmured, using his father's phrase for addressing worthy opponents. "You want to play games? Let's see how well you do against someone who's learned a few tricks of his own." As he broke camp and prepared to move deeper into old Ghost's territory, Garrett felt a familiar tightness in his chest. Not fear, but the heightened awareness that came from knowing the real hunt was finally beginning. Somewhere up in the rocks and timber, a legend was waiting for him. And for the first time in 15 years, Garrett Stone was ready to meet his destiny. While Garrett made his careful way deeper into the high country, Victoria found herself unable to focus on the familiar routines that had sustained her through 3 years of widowhood. She moved through her trading post like a woman in a dream, mechanically arranging supplies and serving customers, while her mind remained fixed on the wilderness where a man she barely knew was risking his life to settle accounts with her past. That afternoon, she climbed the narrow stairs to the living quarters above the storeroom she'd shared with Theodore during the brief golden years of their marriage. The space felt hollow now, filled with furniture that served no purpose and memories that brought more pain than comfort. But today, something drew her to the cedar chest at the foot of their marriage bed. Inside, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, were Theodore's personal effects, the items too precious to display, but too meaningful to discard. His pocket watch, stopped forever at the moment of his death. His reading glasses, the wire frames bent from some final struggle. And at the bottom of the chest, something she'd forgotten until this moment. A brass compass that had belonged to his father, passed down through 3 generations of Harrington men. Victoria lifted the compass with trembling hands, remembering how Theodore used to consult it during their evening walks, teaching her to read the landscape the way his father had taught him. The brass was tarnished now, but the needle still swung true, pointing steadily toward magnetic north with the same reliability that had guided Theodore through countless wilderness adventures. As she held the compass, memories flooded back, not the dark ones that usually haunted her, but the bright recollections of their courtship and early marriage. Theodore, arriving at her father's door in Boston, sunburned and magnificent in his buckskins, speaking of a trading post in Colorado where they could build something lasting together. Their wedding day in the small church her father had built. For her mother, Theodore's hand shaking as he slipped the ring onto her finger. The journey west had been hard, but Victoria remembered it now as the happiest time of her life. Every mile had taken them further from the constraints of civilized society and deeper into a world where their love could flourish without the judgment of others. Theodore had been so alive then, so full of plans for their future, the children they would raise, the empire they would build, the legacy they would leave in the wild heart of America. "We'll name the first boy after my father," he'd said during one of their evenings by the campfire, his arm around her shoulders as they watched the stars emerge in the vast western sky. "And if it's a girl, she'll be strong like her mother strong. Enough to love this country the way it deserves to be loved." But the children had never come, and now Theodore was gone, and Victoria was left alone with dreams that had died in a canyon she'd never seen but would never forget. A knock at the door interrupted her reverie. She dried her eyes quickly and made her way downstairs, expecting to find another customer or perhaps one of the townspeople checking on her welfare. Instead, she found Martha Kellerman, the blacksmith's wife, standing on the porch with her arms crossed and a grim expression on her weathered face. "Victoria Harrington," Martha said without preamble. "We need to talk." Victoria stepped aside to let the older woman enter. Martha had been her closest friend since arriving in Silver Creek, a practical woman who'd raised 7 children and buried 2 husbands without losing her capacity for both kindness and brutal honesty. "It's about this Stone fellow," Martha said. settling herself in the chair beside the counter. "The whole town's talking, and I'll tell you straight folks are worried." "Worried about what?" Victoria asked, though she already knew the answer. "About you getting too attached to another man who's likely to end up dead in those mountains." Martha's voice was gentle but firm. "Victoria, honey, you can't keep doing this to yourself. 25 men have tried and failed. What makes you think this one's any different?" Victoria turned Theodore's compass over in her hands, feeling its solid weight. "He is different, Martha. He understands what he's facing up there. So did Big Jim Hawkins, and we found his rifle barrel twisted." "Like a pretzel?" Martha leaned forward, her eyes filled with concern. "Victoria, I've watched you torture yourself for 3 years over Theodore's death. Don't make it worse by pinning your hopes on another man who's walking into the same trap." "It's not a trap," Victoria said quietly. "It's justice." "Justice?" Martha's voice rose. "Child, what justice is there in feeding good men to a monster? Theodore's gone, and all the dead bears in Colorado won't bring him back." Victoria looked up from the compass, and Martha was startled by the intensity in her friend's green eyes. "Garrett Stone isn't going up there to court me, Martha. He's going because that bear killed his family 15 years ago. This isn't about my challenge anymore. This is about 2 people who've been carrying the same burden finally getting the chance to set it down." Martha was quiet for a long moment, studying Victoria's face with the sharp attention of someone who'd learned to read people through decades of frontier life. "You care about him," she said finally. "It wasn't a question. I barely know him." "That's not what I asked." Victoria turned away, moving to the window that looked out toward the mountains where Garrett was making his careful way toward a confrontation 15 years in the making. "Yes," she whispered, "I care about him. God help me, Martha. I care about him more than I should after knowing him for less than 2 days." "Then call him back," Martha said urgently. "Send riders after him. Tell him you've changed your mind." "I can't do that." "Why not?" Victoria turned back to face her friend, and Martha saw something in her expression that made her understand the conversation was over. "Because," Victoria said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes, "some ghosts can only be laid to rest by the people they've been haunting. And Garrett Stone and I have been haunted by the same ghost for far too long." After Martha left, Victoria climbed back upstairs and carefully placed Theodore's compass on the windowsill where she could see it from her bed. The needle pointed steadily north, toward the high country where 2 destinies were converging in ways she couldn't yet imagine. That night, she dreamed of a scarred man walking through moonlit forest, following tracks that led toward confrontation. That would either free them both or destroy them completely. And somewhere in the darkness of the dream, a massive shape moved through the trees, patient and intelligent and utterly without mercy. When she woke before dawn, the compass needle was still pointing north, true as the love that had brought her to this valley and steady as the hope that might yet carry her through to whatever came next. On his 3rd day in the high country, Garrett found what he'd been dreading, the remains of the last man to take Victoria's challenge. The scene was laid out like a gruesome lesson in the difference between hunting animals and hunting killers. Jeremy Walsh had been a competent woodsman by all accounts, a former Army scout who'd approached Victoria's challenge with military precision and modern equipment. His gear was scattered across a small meadow near a stream crossing, and Garrett could read the story of his final moments in the torn canvas and twisted metal that had once been a state-of-the-art hunting outfit. Walsh's rifle lay in 2 pieces beside a granite boulder not broken by accident, but deliberately snapped in half by jaws powerful enough to bend steel. The stock showed deep gouges from claws that had raked across the polished wood like fingers across piano keys. But it was the methodical way the weapon had been destroyed that made Garrett's blood run cold. This wasn't the random destruction of an enraged animal. This was a calculated demonstration of superiority. The bear had taken Walsh's rifle apart the way a master craftsman might disassemble a clock, understanding exactly how to render each component useless. The barrel was twisted into an impossible spiral, the trigger mechanism crushed flat, and the brass fittings scattered in a perfect circle around the impact site. Old Ghost had turned the man's most trusted tool into a monument to human arrogance. Garrett knelt beside the broken weapon and ran his fingers along the twisted metal, feeling the cold reality of what he was facing settle into his bones. The other hunters had been dealing with an animal. He was dealing with something that had transcended the normal limitations of its species, a creature that had learned to think like a man while retaining all the deadly advantages of a grizzly bear. The tracks around the meadow told a story that made Garrett revise every assumption he'd made about Old Ghost's hunting methods. The bear hadn't simply attacked Walsh in a moment of opportunity. It had orchestrated an elaborate trap that had taken hours to prepare. Deep gouges in the trees showed where the grizzly had marked the area days earlier, establishing territorial claims that would funnel any human visitor toward this exact spot. The stream crossing was the key. Walsh had been forced to approach from the south by a series of deadfalls that blocked every other route, deadfalls that showed clear signs of deliberate placement. Once committed to the meadow, he'd been caught in the open with nowhere to retreat and no cover to use for defense. Old Ghost had turned the entire landscape into a killing field, and Walsh had walked into it like a lamb to slaughter. But the most disturbing discovery was what Garrett found near the stream itself. Carved into the bark of a massive pine tree were symbols that made his throat tighten with recognition, not random claw marks, but deliberately placed cuts that formed a crude but unmistakable pattern. Tally marks. Old Ghost was keeping score. Garrett counted the marks carefully, his heart sinking as the numbers climbed. 25 vertical lines, each one representing a man who died trying to claim Victoria's challenge. And at the end of the row, a fresh cut that could only represent Jeremy Walsh, a mark made after the kill. When the bear had returned to update its grotesque record, the implications hit Garrett like a physical blow. Old Ghost wasn't just defending territory or responding to threats, it was actively hunting the men who came into its domain. The bear had learned to associate human intrusion with the deadly game it had been playing for years, and each kill had made it more confident, more creative, and infinitely more dangerous. As Garrett studied the tally tree, a new sound reached his ears, the distant crack of breaking branches coming from the forest behind him. He turned slowly, every instinct screaming danger, and saw something that made his blood freeze in his veins. Old Ghost was watching him from the edge of the meadow. The bear stood motionless among the shadows of the pine trees, its massive form blending so perfectly with the dark timber that Garrett might have missed it entirely if not for the glint of intelligence in its small, dark eyes. Even at a distance of 100 yards, the creature's size was overwhelming, easily 9 feet tall at the shoulder, with a breadth of chest that spoke of power beyond anything Garrett had ever encountered. But it was the bear's behavior that truly unnerved him. Old Ghost wasn't displaying the aggressive posturing typical of a territorial grizzly. No roaring, no charges, no attempts at intimidation. Instead, it simply watched with the patient attention of a chess master studying his opponent's opening moves. The bear was learning, cataloging every detail of Garrett's appearance and behavior for future reference. For nearly 10 minutes, predator and prey faced each other across the meadow in absolute silence. Garrett forced himself to remain calm, knowing that any sudden movement might trigger an attack he couldn't survive. Instead, he used the time to study his opponent with the same intensity that Old Ghost was studying him. The bear's coat was silver-tipped, black, marked with scars that told the story of decades spent fighting everything from other grizzlies to the occasional mountain lion foolish enough to challenge it. Its right ear was partially torn, and a long white scar ran from its left shoulder to its massive chest, battle wounds that had only made it stronger and more cunning. Most disturbing of all were the bear's eyes. Garrett had looked into the eyes of many dangerous predators over the years, but he'd never seen anything like the cold intelligence that stared back at him from Old Ghost's face. This wasn't the simple hunger of a carnivore or the territorial aggression of a challenged male. This was the calculating gaze of something that had learned to find pleasure in the hunt itself. When Old Ghost finally moved, it did so with deliberate slowness, turning away from the meadow and disappearing into the forest as silently as it had appeared. But Garrett understood the message clearly. The bear had announced its presence, established its dominance, and issued a challenge that could only be answered with blood. That night, Garrett made camp in a defensible position on a rocky outcrop that offered clear sightlines in all directions. As he sat beside his small fire, he found himself thinking about Victoria, wondering if she was lying awake in her bed above the trading post, staring at Theodore's compass and trying not to imagine what was happening in the mountains. He pulled out Theodore's journal and read the final entries again, understanding now why the man had chosen to face Old Ghost in Devil's Canyon despite knowing it was a trap. Some confrontations couldn't be avoided. They could only be postponed until the weight of waiting became heavier than the fear of dying. Garrett Stone had spent 15 years preparing for this moment, and now that it was finally here, he felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. Tomorrow, he would begin the final phase of a hunt that had started the day Old Ghost killed his family. Whatever happened in the coming days, at least the waiting would finally be over. Victoria's sleepless nights were becoming a pattern that threatened to consume what remained of her sanity. Each evening brought the same ritual, climbing the stairs to her empty bedroom, lighting the oil lamp beside Theodore's compass, and staring out the window toward mountains that held both her deepest fears and her most desperate hopes. On the fourth night after Garrett's departure, she gave up the pretense of sleep entirely. Instead, she dressed in her warmest clothes and made her way to Theodore's study, a small room behind the trading post where he'd kept his maps, journals, and correspondence with suppliers throughout the territory. She hadn't entered the room since his death, but tonight something drew her to the leather-bound volumes that contained his thoughts about the wilderness he'd loved so deeply dawed by lamplight. She read through Theodore's earlier journals, the ones from before Old Ghost had become his obsession. The writing revealed a man of deep sensitivity and philosophical bent, someone who saw the mountains not as a resource to be exploited, but as a sacred trust to be protected. His descriptions of sunrise over the peaks, of wildlife moving through moonlit meadows, of the profound silence that could only be found in places untouched by civilization, these passages showed her a side of her husband she'd never fully appreciated. "The mountain teaches patience," Theodore had written during their second year in Silver Creek. "It shows a man how small he is in the grand design, how temporary his concerns are against the eternal rhythm of seasons and storms. A wise man learns to move with that rhythm instead of fighting it. The mountain will always win in the end, but it respects those who understand their place in its kingdom." Victoria traced the words with her finger, remembering how Theodore used to speak about the delicate balance between man and wilderness. He'd believed that people could live in harmony with the mountains if they approached them with the proper respect and humility. But somewhere along the way, his philosophy had changed. The later journals showed a growing obsession with Old Ghost, a conviction that some predators had moved beyond the natural order and needed to be stopped. Hidden beneath a stack of territorial maps, Victoria found something that made her hands tremble, a collection of love letters Theodore had written, but never given her. The dates showed they'd been composed during his final months, when his pursuit of Old Ghost had consumed more and more of his time and attention. "My dearest Victoria," the first letter began, "I know my hunt for this creature has taken me away from you more than a husband should leave his wife. But I need you to understand that this isn't about pride or the thrill of the chase. Old Ghost represents something dangerous, not just to our livestock or our neighbors, but to the very idea that civilization can flourish in these mountains. As long as that bear lives, every family in this valley will sleep a little less soundly. The subsequent letters revealed the depth of Theodore's internal struggle. He'd known that his obsession was costing him precious time with Victoria, but he'd been unable to abandon what he saw as his responsibility to protect the community they'd helped build. Each letter contained apologies, explanations, and promises to return safely, promises he'd ultimately been unable to keep. The final letter, dated just 1 week before his death, contained words that cut through Victoria's heart like a blade. "I've had a dream 3 nights running, now the same dream each time. I see Old Ghost standing in Devil's Canyon, waiting for me with the patience of something that knows its time has come. In the dream, I'm not afraid. I walk toward it willingly, understanding that some stories can only end one way. If something happens to me in the mountains, I need you to know that I chose this path not because I loved you less, but because I loved our life together so much that I couldn't bear to see it threatened." Victoria set the letter down with shaking hands, finally understanding the terrible weight Theodore had carried during those final months. He'd gone into the mountains not as a reckless hunter seeking glory, but as a protector who believed his sacrifice might purchase safety for the woman he loved. And now she'd sent another man, a man she was beginning to care for, despite herself, to face the same fate. A soft knock at the door interrupted her grief. Victoria wiped her eyes and went to answer it, expecting to find Martha Kellerman or perhaps one of the townspeople checking on her welfare. Instead, she found a stranger standing on her porch, a weathered man in buckskins whose nervous manner and darting eyes marked him as someone bearing unwelcome news. "Mrs. Harrington?" the man said, removing his hat respectfully. "Name's Pete Morrison. I'm a trapper, work the high country north of here. I've got news about your mountain man. I've got news about your mountain man." Victoria's heart clenched. What kind of news? "Saw him yesterday, maybe 20 miles up the North Fork. He was studying something in a meadow looked like the remains of a camp. But ma'am, that ain't what's got me worried." Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "That bear you folks have been hunting? I saw it too. And it was watching your man like a cat watches a mouse. Was Mr. Stone in danger? Hard to say. The bear didn't attack, but it didn't run neither. Just stood there in the trees, studying him. I've been trapping these mountains for 15 years, and I ain't never seen a grizzly behave like that. Most bears, they either charge or they run. This one was thinking." Victoria invited Morrison inside and poured him coffee while he told her everything he'd observed. The trapper's account confirmed her worst fears. Old Ghost wasn't simply defending its territory against another intruder. It was actively stalking Garrett, learning his habits and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "Your man knows his business, I'll give him that," Morrison said as he prepared to leave. He made camp in a smart spot, kept his fire small, stayed alert all night. But Mrs. Harrington, that bear knows its business too. And it's been playing this game a lot longer than any human. After Morrison left, Victoria found herself standing once again at the window that looked toward the mountains. Theodore's compass sat on the sill, its needle pointing steadily north toward a confrontation that seemed increasingly inevitable. But for the first time since Garrett's departure, Victoria felt something other than helpless anxiety. Theodore's letters had revealed the depth of his love for her and his commitment to protecting their future together. But they'd also shown her something else, the crushing isolation he'd felt as he'd wrestled with decisions that would affect not just his own life, but the lives of everyone he cared about. Garrett Stone was facing the same burden now, carrying the same weight of responsibility that had driven Theodore to Devil's Canyon. But unlike her husband, Garrett didn't have to face that burden alone. Victoria returned to Theodore's study and began gathering the most detailed maps of the high country, along with his journal entries about old Ghost's behavior and territory. If Garrett was determined to see this hunt through to its conclusion, then he deserved to have every advantage she could give him. As dawn approached, Victoria Harrington made a decision that would have shocked everyone who knew her. She wasn't going to sit in her trading post, waiting passively for news of another man's death. She was going into the mountains to find Garrett Stone, and together they would face whatever old Ghost had planned for them. Some burdens, she now understood, were too heavy for one person to carry alone. Garrett's sixth day in the high country began with a discovery that changed everything he thought he knew about old Ghost and the deadly game they'd been playing. Following tracks that led deeper into territory no white man had mapped, Garrett found himself in a hidden valley that seemed untouched by time. Ancient petroglyphs covered the canyon walls, and scattered among the boulder fields were the remains of structures that predated any European presence in the region by centuries. But it was what he found at the center of the valley that made him understand how completely he'd misunderstood his quarry. Arranged in a perfect circle around a natural spring were the ritual objects of a Ute ceremonial site, prayer wheels carved from stone, medicine bundles wrapped in elk hide, and at the center of it all, a carved wooden pipe whose bowl had been blackened by countless sacred fires. The site radiated the kind of spiritual power that could be felt rather than seen, a presence that made even the wind seem to whisper with reverence. Garrett approached the circle with the careful respect his father had taught him to show in such places. He'd lived among the Ute people for 2 seasons during his youth, learning their language and customs while recovering from wounds suffered in his first encounter with the grizzly that had killed his family. The arrangement of objects told a Jinde story that any student of tribal lore could read. This was a place where warriors came to seek visions before undertaking journeys from which they might never return. You understand the significance of this place. The voice came from behind him, calm and measured, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Garrett turned slowly, his hand moving instinctively toward his rifle before stopping. An elderly Ute man stood at the edge of the ceremonial circle, his weathered face marked with the kind of dignity that came from a lifetime of wisdom earned through hardship. The man was perhaps 70 years old, dressed in traditional buckskins, decorated with intricate beadwork that identified him as a person of high status within his tribe. His gray hair was braided with eagle feathers, and around his neck hung a medicine bag that radiated the same spiritual power as the ceremonial site itself. But it was his eyes that commanded attention, dark and penetrating. They held depths that suggested he'd seen far more than most men would witness in several lifetimes. "I am Joseph Crowfeather," the elder said, speaking English with the careful precision of someone for whom it was a second language. "I am the keeper of the old stories, the guardian of sacred knowledge that white men have forgotten. And you, Garrett Stone, are walking a path that leads to more than you understand." Garrett felt no surprise that the man knew his name. Among the Ute people, knowledge traveled in ways that white men often found mysterious but rarely questioned. Instead, he offered the traditional greeting his adopted father had taught him, speaking in the Ute language with the fluency of long practice. "I greet you, grandfather, and ask permission to hear your words." Joseph Crowfeather smiled, an expression that transformed his austere features and revealed the warmth beneath his formal demeanor. "You remember the old courtesies. That is good. It shows respect for traditions that predate the anger that has brought you to this place." The elder gestured for Garrett to sit beside the spring, then settled himself on a flat stone that bore the polish of countless similar conversations. For several minutes, neither man spoke. In the Ute tradition, important discussions required time to develop naturally, like plants growing toward sunlight. "The bear you hunt," Joseph Crowfeather said finally, "has a name among my people. We call him Thunderwalker. and his story is older than the white settlements in this valley. Garrett leaned forward, understanding that he was about to learn something that would redefine everything about his quest. Tell me about Thunder Walker. 40 years ago, when I was still young enough to hunt in the high places, Thunder Walker was not the creature of rage and death that haunts your dreams. He was the guardian of this valley, chosen by the spirits to protect the sacred places from those who would defile them. For many seasons, he lived in peace with the you people, understanding that we took only what we needed and gave back more than we consumed. The elder paused to pack tobacco into the ceremonial pipe, lighting it with a burning twig from a small fire that seemed to have appeared without Garrett noticing its creation. The smoke rose straight up in the still air, carrying prayers to the spirits that watched over all living things. But then the miners came. Joseph Crowfeather continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a man recounting tribal history. They blasted sacred mountains to reach the gold beneath, poisoned the streams with their chemicals, killed without need or ceremony. Thunder Walker tried to drive them away, but they responded with greater violence. They dynamited his den, killed his mate and cubs, wounded him with poisons that burned his body and twisted his spirit. Garrett felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. They made him into what he became. Yes, the creature you call Old Ghost is what remains when a sacred guardian is driven beyond the boundaries of natural law. Thunder Walker became something the spirits never intend, a being that exists only to punish those who violate the harmony between man and nature. The implications crashed over Garrett like an avalanche. Every man who'd taken Victoria's challenge hadn't been hunting a rogue animal. They'd been facing a spiritual force whose very existence was a response to humanity's failure to respect the natural world. Theodore Harrington, Jeremy Walsh, all the others, they died not because they were unlucky or unprepared, but because they'd been judged by something that operated according to laws older than civilization. Then the men who died were not murdered, Joseph Crowfeather said gently. They were tested and found wanting. Thunder Walker has become the judge of all who enter his domain, measuring them against a standard that few understand and fewer still can meet. What standard? The elder studied Garrett's face with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. The same standard by which all sacred guardians measure worthiness, not by strength or cunning or weapons, but by the purity of intention that brought them to this place. Garrett thought about the 25 men who died attempting Victoria's challenge, then about his own motivations for accepting it. I came here for revenge. No, Joseph Crowfeather said quietly. You came here carrying the pain of loss, seeking an end to suffering that has poisoned your spirit for 15 years. Thunder Walker can see the difference, even if you cannot. Before Garrett could respond, the sound of approaching hooves echoed through the valley. Both men turned to see a horse and rider picking their way carefully down the narrow trail that led to the ceremonial site. Even at a distance, Garrett recognized Victoria Harrington's determined posture and the chestnut mare she'd ridden during her courtship with Theodore. She follows you into sacred places, Joseph Crowfeather observed. That speaks well of the bond between you. Victoria dismounted and approached the ceremonial circle with visible uncertainty, clearly understanding that she'd stumbled into something far more significant than a chance meeting between two men. When she saw the ritual objects and the elder's traditional dress, she stopped just outside the circle and waited for permission to enter. Come forward, daughter, Joseph Crowfeather said in English. The spirits have brought you here for reasons that will soon become clear. Victoria entered the circle and sat beside Garrett, her presence immediately changing the dynamic of the day and the dynamic of the conversation. The elder studied her with the same penetrating attention he'd focused on Garrett, and gradually his expression shifted from assessment to something approaching approval. You are the widow who sends men to face Thunder Walker, he said. It wasn't a question. I am, Victoria replied. her voice steady despite the obvious tension in her posture. "And I've come to stop another good man from dying for my mistakes. Joseph." Crowfeather was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made both Garrett and Victoria understand they were receiving knowledge that could reshape their understanding of everything they believed about their quest. "Thunder Walker has been waiting 40 years for someone to understand what he has become," the elder said. "Not to kill him, but to release him from the burden of judgment that was never meant to be carried by one spirit alone." He gestured toward the ceremonial pipe, its smoke still rising straight into the mountain air. "There is another way to end this story, a path that honors both the dead and the living, that restores the balance Thunder Walker was created to protect. But it requires courage of a different kind than what brought you to this valley." Garrett and Victoria exchanged glances, both understanding that their carefully planned confrontation with Old Ghost was about to become something neither of them had imagined possible. Joseph Crowfeather reached into his medicine bag and withdrew an object that seemed to pulse with its own inner light, a bare-toothed amulet the size of a man's thumb, carved with symbols that predated written language and polished smooth by generations of handling. The tooth hung from a leather cord that had been braided with strands of silver hair, and touching it sent a shock of recognition through Garrett's entire body. "This belonged to Thunder Walker's mate," the elder said, placing the amulet in Garrett's palm. "She was killed defending her cubs from the miners who destroyed their family. Her spirit remains bound to this token, waiting for the day when Thunder Walker can be released from his burden of rage." Garrett stared at the amulet, feeling the weight of history and tragedy compressed into its ancient surface. The carvings seemed to shift and move in the changing light, revealing glimpses of scenes that might have been memory or vision. A massive she-bear defending her young, explosions that shattered mountain stone, and always the overwhelming presence of grief that had transformed love into something darker and more dangerous. "What must we do?" Victoria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Joseph Crowfeather turned his attention to her, and Victoria felt the full force of his spiritual authority like a physical presence. "You must release the anger that has driven both of you to this place. Thunder Walker cannot find peace while those he guards carry the same poison that corrupted his own spirit." "I don't understand," Victoria said. "Your husband came to these mountains carrying hatred for the creature that threatened your settlement," the elder explained patiently. "That hatred made him blind to Thunder Walker's true nature, and it ultimately led to his death. Now you have sent another man, a man you care for deeply, to face the same fate while carrying the same spiritual poison." Victoria felt tears stinging her eyes as the truth of his words settled into her heart. "I wanted revenge." "Yes, and revenge is what transforms guardians into destroyers, protectors into killers. Thunder Walker has been waiting for someone to approach him without hatred, someone who can see past the creature of legend to the wounded spirit beneath." Garrett closed his fingers around the bare tooth amulet, feeling its warmth spread through his hand like a benediction. "How do we reach him?" "There is a ceremony," Joseph Crowfeather said. "An ancient ritual that my grandfather's grandfather performed when sacred guardians lost their way. But it requires perfect trust between those who attempt it, an absolute commitment to the path of healing rather than destruction." The elder gestured toward the ceremonial objects arranged around the spring. "Tonight, when the moon reaches its highest point, Thunder Walker will come to this place. He comes here every month, drawn by memories of what he once was and the hope that someday he might find peace. If you are here to meet him, if you approach him with the proper spirit and the proper understanding, then the cycle of violence can finally end." Victoria looked around the sacred circle, trying to imagine facing the creature that had haunted her dreams for 3 years. "What if we fail? What if he's too far gone to be reached?" "Then you will die," Joseph Crowfeather said with the matter of fact. acceptance of someone who'd spent his life dealing with spiritual realities. But you will die attempting to heal rather than to destroy, and that intention will itself be a form of victory. As the afternoon wore on, the elder taught them the specifics of the ceremony that could either save Thunder Walker's spirit or claim their lives. The ritual was complex, requiring precise movements and ancient words that carry power beyond their literal meaning. But more than technical knowledge, it demanded a transformation of spirit that neither Garrett nor Victoria was certain they could achieve. "I've carried hatred for 15 years," Garrett admitted as they practiced the ceremonial movements. "I don't know if I can simply set it aside because an ancient ritual requires it." "The amulet will help," Joseph Crowfeather assured him. Thunder Walker's mate was a creature of pure love, even in death. "Her spirit will guide you toward the understanding you need." Victoria struggled with her own doubts as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. Everything she'd believed about her husband's death, about the nature of the creature that had killed him, about the rightness of her quest for vengeance, all of it was being turned upside down by knowledge that challenged the very foundations of her worldview. "Theodore came here to kill a monster," she said, trying to reconcile the elder's teachings with her memories of her husband's final obsession. "Are you telling me he died because he couldn't see that the monster was really a victim?" "Your husband died because he could not release the fear that drove him to hunt Thunder Walker," Joseph Crowfeather replied gently. "Fear for your safety, fear for the future of your settlement, fear that he was not strong enough to protect what he loved." Those fears transformed him into something Thunder Walker could only see as a threat. As twilight painted the mountains in shades of purple and gold, riders appeared on the rim of the hidden valley townspeople from Silver Creek who had followed Victoria's trail into the high country. Garrett counted at least a dozen men, including Martha Kellerman's husband, and several of the shop owners who had tried to dissuade Victoria from allowing another challenger. "They've come to bring us back," Victoria said, watching the distant figures making their way down the treacherous trail. "No," Joseph Crowfeather said, his voice carrying new urgency. "They've come to kill Thunder Walker before he can claim another victim. They carry rifles and determination, but no understanding of what they face." Garrett felt the weight of decision pressing down on him like a physical force. The townspeople were good men, trying to protect someone they cared about from what they saw as inevitable death. But their intervention would destroy any chance of reaching Thunder Walker through ceremony and transform the evening into exactly the kind of violent confrontation that had already claimed too many lives. "We have to warn them off," Victoria sighed, starting to rise. "There isn't time," the elder said, pointing toward the eastern sky where the moon was already beginning to show above the peaks. "Thunder Walker will come with the full moonrise, and if he finds armed men waiting for him, his response will be swift and final." Garrett looked at Victoria, seeing his own struggle reflected in her green eyes. They could abandon the ceremony and try to lead the townspeople to safety, but that would mean accepting that Thunder Walker would continue his deadly judgment of anyone who entered his domain. Or they could proceed with the ritual, trusting that ancient wisdom could accomplish what modern weapons had repeatedly failed to achieve. "Your choice," he said quietly. Victoria turned the wedding ring on her finger, feeling its familiar weight for what she suddenly knew would be the last time. Slowly, deliberately, she slipped the band from her finger and placed it beside the ceremonial spring, a symbolic release of the past that made room for whatever the future might hold. "We continue with the ceremony," she said, her voice steady, with newfound resolve. "If those men have any sense, they'll stay back and let us try to end this the right way." Joseph Crowfeather nodded approvingly and began the final preparations for the ritual. He painted their faces with clay mixed from the sacred spring, marking them with symbols that would identify them to Thunder Walker as seekers of peace rather than agents of violence. The bear-tooth amulet was placed around Garrett's neck, where it rested against his heart, like a second pulse dot as the moon climbed higher, casting silver light across the ceremonial circle. The three of them took their positions according to the ancient pattern. Garrett stood at the eastern point, representing the dawn of new understanding. Victoria took her place at the western point, symbolizing the release of old pain. Joseph Crowfeather positioned himself at the center, serving as the bridge between human and spiritual worlds. The first sign of Thunderwalker's approach was a change in the behavior of the night creatures. Owls fell silent. Coyotes stopped their calling, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Then came the sound they'd been waiting for, the deliberate crack of branches being pushed aside by something massive, moving through the forest with purpose and intelligence. "Remember," Joseph Crowfeather whispered, "approach him with love, not fear. See the wounded spirit, not the legendary killer. And trust in the power of healing to overcome the poison of revenge." Thunderwalker emerged from the tree line like a force of nature made manifest, 9 feet of muscle and fury moving, with the fluid grace of something that had transcended the normal limitations of its species. But as he entered the moonlit circle, Garrett saw something in the bear's eyes that changed everything he thought he knew about their adversary. Beneath the rage and the accumulated pain of 40 years, Thunderwalker's eyes held a depth of sorrow that spoke of a spirit yearning for release from burdens it was never meant to carry. This wasn't a monster. This was a broken guardian, desperate for someone to understand what he had become and help him find his way back to what he was supposed to be. The ceremony was about to begin. Thunderwalker stood at the edge of the ceremonial circle like a mountain given life, his massive form seeming to absorb and reflect the moonlight that bathed the sacred valley. For a moment that stretched into eternity, the great bear surveyed the 3 humans who waited for him with neither weapons nor fear. And something shifted in his ancient eyes, a flicker of recognition that suggested memories buried beneath decades of pain and rage. Garrett felt the bear-tooth amulet grow warm against his chest as Joseph Crowfeather began the opening chant. Words in the old language that seemed to resonate through the earth itself and up into the star-filled sky. The elder's voice carried the weight of countless generations, calling upon spirits and ancestors to witness what might be the final chapter in a story that had begun long before any of them were born. As the chanting continued, Thunderwalker moved closer to the circle with steps that were deliberate and measured. Each footfall seemed to shake the ground, but there was no aggression in his approach. Only a careful attention that spoke of intelligence far beyond what most humans attributed to his kind. When he reached the edge of the sacred space, he stopped and lowered his massive head, as if acknowledging the power of the ritual that was unfolding before him. It was then that Garrett saw something that made his breath catch in his throat around Thunderwalker's neck, almost hidden by his thick fur, was a leather collar. Not the crude restraint of captivity, but something crafted with love and ceremony, decorated with beadwork that matched the patterns on Joseph Crowfeather's ceremonial dress. The collar was old, ancient even, and it spoke of a time when this magnificent creature had lived in harmony with the people who had honored him as a sacred guardian. "He remembers," Joseph Crowfeather whispered, his voice filled with wonder. "After all these years of pain and anger, some part of him still remembers what he was before the violence changed him." Victoria stepped forward according to the ritual pattern, her movements slow and respectful. As she approached Thunderwalker, she could see the scars that marked his body, not just the physical wounds from battles fought and survived, but something deeper. The bear's eyes held a pain that transcended the physical, a spiritual injury that had festered for decades without healing. "I see you," Victoria said softly, using the words Joseph Crowfeather had taught her. "I see the guardian you were meant to be, not the killer you were forced to become." Thunderwalker's response was immediate and profound. The great bear sank to his haunches, then lowered himself further until he was lying on the ground in a posture of submission that no wild grizzly would ever adopt. But this wasn't submission born of defeat. It was the gesture of a spirit that had finally found someone who understood its true nature. Garrett moved to his position in the ceremonial pattern, the bear-tooth amulet now burning against his skin, with an energy that seemed to connect him directly to Thunder Walker's wounded spirit. As he looked into the bear's eyes, he saw not the monster that had haunted his dreams for 15 years, but a creature that had been broken by the same kind of loss that had driven Garrett to seek revenge. "Your mate," Garrett said, his voice thick with emotion. "She's here with us. She's been waiting for you to find peace." At the mention of his lost companion, Thunder Walker made a sound unlike anything Garrett had ever heard from a bear, a low, mournful keen that spoke of grief so profound it had become the defining feature of his existence. The amulet around Garrett's neck pulsed with warm light, and suddenly the air around them seemed to shimmer with a presence that was both invisible and undeniably real. Joseph Profeather raised his arms toward the moon, his voice lifting in the ancient song that would either complete the healing ceremony or witness their deaths. The words seemed to call down the very spirits of the mountains, and Thunder Walker responded by rising slowly to his feet and moving into the center of the sacred circle. For the first time in 40 years, the great bear was choosing trust over violence, hope over despair. As he settled himself beside the ceremonial spring, Thunder Walker looked directly at Garrett and Victoria with eyes that no longer held rage, but something far more powerful, the possibility of redemption for them all. The final phase of the ceremony required Garrett to approach Thunder Walker directly, to place his hand upon the great bear's head and speak the words that would either complete the healing or trigger a violent end to their attempt at redemption. As he moved forward, Garrett felt the weight of 15 years lifting from his shoulders, replaced by something lighter but infinitely more powerful, the understanding that some wounds could only be healed by choosing love over revenge. Thunder Walker watched Garrett's approach with eyes that held intelligence, pain, and something else, hope. The great bear remained perfectly still as Garrett knelt beside him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his massive body, close enough to see the individual scars that marked decades of violence and survival. "I know your pain," Garrett said softly, his hand moving slowly toward Thunder Walker's head. "I know what it's like to lose everything you love and have that loss poison your spirit until you become something you were never meant to be." His palm made contact with the bear's forehead, and suddenly Garrett was no longer kneeling in a moonlit valley, but standing in a different time and place entirely. Through the connection forged by the bear-tooth amulet, he experienced Thunder Walker's memories as if they were his own, the joy of protecting a sacred valley, the love of a mate and cubs, the peaceful coexistence with humans who understood their place in the natural order. Then came the violence explosions that shattered mountain stone, the taste of poison in the water, the screams of his family as they died defending their home. Garrett felt Thunder Walker's transformation from guardian to avenger, the slow corruption of love into hatred, the decades of killing that had followed as the bear tried to fill the emptiness where his family's love had once lived. But through it all, buried beneath the rage and pain, was the memory of what Thunder Walker had been created to be, a protector, not a destroyer. And in that memory, Garrett found the key to the healing they all desperately needed. "You were never meant to carry this burden alone," Garrett whispered, his other hand moving to the medicine bag his adoptive Ute father had given him years before. From it, he withdrew a small pouch of sacred herbs, mixing them with water from the ceremonial spring to create a paste that he gently applied to the old scars on Thunder Walker's neck. As the healing mixture touched his wounds, Thunder Walker made another of those keening sounds, but this time it carried a different quality. Not grief, but release. The great bear closed his eyes and leaned into Garrett's touch, accepting the healing that had been offered and giving his trust to someone who understood the weight of loss and the possibility of redemption. Victoria moved to complete the triangle, kneeling on Thunder Walker's other side and placing her hand on his massive shoulder. Through the connection, she felt the echo of her own grief transformed into something larger and more meaningful. Not the selfish pain of personal loss, but the universal sorrow that all living things carry for the wounded world they inhabit. "Theodore didn't die because you're evil," she said to Thunder Walker, tears streaming down her face. "He died because neither of you could see past your pain to the healing that was possible. But we can see it now. We can choose differently." Joseph Crowfeather's chanting reached its crescendo, the ancient words calling down power from the spirits of earth and sky. The bear tooth amulet blazed with light that seemed to come from another world entirely, and suddenly the air around them was filled with presences that were felt rather than seen, the spirits of all who had died in the cycle of violence, waiting for the moment when peace could finally be restored. Thunder Walker opened his eyes and looked directly at Garrett, and in that gaze was an acknowledgement that transcended species and language. Two creatures who had been broken by loss were choosing to heal together, to lay down the burden of revenge that had poisoned both their spirits for far too long. The great bear rose slowly to his feet, and for a moment Garrett thought the ceremony had failed. But instead of attacking, Thunder Walker moved to the ceremonial spring and drank deeply from its sacred waters. When he lifted his head, something fundamental had changed in his bearing. The rage was gone, replaced by the dignity of a creature who had remembered his true purpose. As the moon reached its zenith, Thunder Walker approached each of them in turn, touching his massive head to their hands in a gesture that spoke of gratitude, forgiveness, and the possibility of a future free from the violence that had defined his existence for so long. Ancient collar around his neck began to glow with the same light as the bear tooth amulet, and slowly, gently, it dissolved into sparkles of light that rose toward the stars like prayers finally answered. Thunder Walker was free, not just from the physical symbol of his bondage to pain, but from the spiritual burden that had transformed him from guardian into destroyer. The ceremony was complete. The cycle of violence was broken. And in the sacred valley where it had all begun, 3 humans and 1 magnificent bear had discovered that healing was always possible for those brave enough to choose love over revenge. The dawn that followed the healing ceremony brought changes that reached far beyond the sacred valley, where 3 humans and 1 ancient bear had rewritten the rules of an old and bitter story. As the first light touched the peaks surrounding Thunder Walker's domain, Victoria Harrington made a decision that surprised even herself. She removed her black mourning dress for the last time and put on the simple traveling clothes that Theodore had bought for her during their journey west. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. After 3 years of wearing grief like armor, Victoria was finally ready to step into a future that held room for something other than loss. But perhaps more importantly, she was choosing to honor Theodore's memory by embracing the life he'd wanted them to build together rather than remaining trapped in the moment of his death. Thunder Walker had departed before sunrise, disappearing into the high country with the silent grace of something that had rediscovered its true nature. But his transformation had left marks on the landscape that would endure long after the immediate participants in the ceremony had passed into memory. The tally tree, where he kept his grim count of human deaths, stood bare now, its carved marks somehow erased as if they'd never existed. And throughout his former territory, the signs of his rage, the broken camps, the twisted metal, the atmosphere of menace that had hung over the high country like smoke, all of it was gone, replaced by the kind of peace that comes only when old wounds have finally been allowed to heal. The townspeople who had followed Victoria into the mountains arrived at the ceremonial site just as Joseph Crowfeather was preparing to depart. Their relief at finding her alive was matched only by their confusion at the story she and Garrett told them. Bears that were sacred guardians, healing ceremonies conducted under moonlight, the transformation of a legendary killer into something resembling redemption. It was the kind of tale that would grow in the telling, becoming part of the folklore that defined Silver Creek for generations to come. But the practical effects of what had happened were immediate and undeniable. The high country was safe again, not because a monster had been killed, but because a wounded spirit had been healed. And in Silver Creek itself, changes began almost immediately as news of the transformation spread through the territory, like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Victoria's trading post became something different, not just a place to buy supplies, but a destination for those seeking to understand what had really happened in the mountains. The challenge that had claimed 25 lives was replaced by something far more constructive, a program to teach proper respect for the wilderness and its inhabitants. Instead of sending men to their deaths, Victoria began sending them home, with knowledge that would help them live in harmony with the natural world. Garrett found himself appointed as the unofficial guardian of the high country, a role that suited him perfectly after 15 years of wandering. His cabin, built on the site where Thunder Walker's ceremonial collar had dissolved into starlight, became a place where troubled souls could come to learn that healing was possible even for the deepest wounds. The bear-tooth amulet, which had served as the bridge between human and spiritual worlds, hung above his fireplace as a reminder that some things were more powerful than revenge. The relationship between Garrett and Victoria developed slowly, built on the foundation of shared trauma and mutual respect, rather than the passion that had characterized her marriage to Theodore. Their love was the kind that comes to people who have learned the difference between wanting and needing, between the desperate attachment of youth and the steady commitment of maturity. 6 months after the ceremony, Victoria placed a new ring on her finger, not Theodore's wedding band, which remained buried beneath the ceremonial spring as an offering to the spirits who had made healing possible, but a simple silver band that Garrett had crafted from metal found in the sacred valley. The ring bore no elaborate decorations, just a small carving of a bear's paw that served as a permanent reminder of the night when everything changed. Their wedding was held in the valley, where Thunder Walker had been restored to his true nature, with Joseph Crowfeather performing the ceremony according to traditions that honored both their Christian faith and the older spirituality that had saved them all. The vows they exchanged spoke not of conquering life's challenges, but of facing them together, with the wisdom that comes from having survived the worst and chosen to grow stronger rather than more bitter. Thunder Walker himself attended the ceremony, watching from the tree line with the patient dignity of something that understood the significance of human ritual. His presence was a blessing that transformed the occasion from a simple wedding into something approaching a sacrament, the union of two souls who had learned to see beyond their pain to the possibility of joy. In the years that followed, Thunder Walker became a legend of a different sort. Travelers in the high country spoke of encountering a massive bear who watched them with intelligent eyes, evaluating their intentions and guiding lost souls toward safety. Children in Silver Creek grew up hearing stories of the great guardian who protected the mountains from those who would harm them, and harmed only those who brought violence into his domain. The story of Victoria's challenge became part of the oral tradition of the territory, but it was told differently now. Instead of a tale about the folly of men who thought they could prove their worth through violence, it became a story about the power of understanding to transform even the most bitter enemies into allies. Parents told it to their children as a reminder that strength comes not from the ability to destroy, but from the wisdom to heal. And on certain nights when the moon was full and the mountain air was still, travelers claimed they could hear sounds drifting down from the high country, not the roar of an angry beast, but something that might have been singing. Thunder Walker, they said, had remembered the songs his mate used to sing to their cubs, and in the safety of his restored domain, he was finally free to mourn what he had lost and celebrate what he had found. The mountains were at peace, and so were the people who had learned to see them not as something to be conquered, but as something to be protected with the same fierce love that had once driven them to seek revenge.